The forest was supposed to be an escape, a retreat into simplicity. 6 friends, Elena, Tom, Marcus, Ava, Jess, and Dan, had driven 3 hours into the heart of Black Hollow, a dense stretch of wilderness renowned for its beauty and isolation. It was Ava's idea, spurred on by her love for untouched nature and the promise of a perfect campsite she'd read about in an obscure online forum. By mid-afternoon, they had pitched their tents in a small clearing encircled by ancient pines. The air was sharp with the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the occasional chirp of distant birds. "This place is amazing," Ava said, adjusting her camera. "No cell signal, no noise, just pure nature." "Or a serial killer's paradise," Jess joked, prompting a laugh from the group. Dan rolled his eyes. "Let's not start with that crap, all right? We're here to chill." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the forest in hues of amber and crimson, the group gathered around a crackling fire. Stories and laughter filled the air, but as night fell, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees, once inviting, became looming silhouettes. The first omen. Tom woke first. It wasn't the dawn light that stirred him, but the silence. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive stillness. He stepped out of his tent, shivering as the cold air bit into his skin. The fire had burned out, leaving only a few smoldering embers. Then he saw them. Footprints circling their campsite. "You aren't human." Tom crouched down, tracing the oddly shaped impressions in the dirt. The prints were elongated, with claw-like tips. He glanced around, heart hammering, but the forest stood still, as if holding its breath. When the others emerged, he showed them the tracks. "Probably just a bear," Marcus suggested, though his voice wavered. "Bears don't walk in circles around campsites," Tom snapped. Elena crossed her arms. "So what do you think it was?" Tom shook his head. "I don't know, but we should move." Ava groaned. "We just got here." But unease had settled over the group, and by mid-morning they were packing their gear and heading deeper into the forest. The wrong turn. The trails in Black Hollow were faint at best, winding through dense thickets and tangled roots. By early afternoon, it became clear they were lost. Ava's map was useless, and the GPS had no signal. "What now?" Jess asked, her voice laced with frustration. "We keep moving until we find a landmark," Dan said, though he didn't sound confident. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker, even though the sun was still high. The air seemed thicker, the trees pressing closer together. They began to notice things that hadn't been there before. Scraps of cloth hanging from branches, strange wooden effigies tied together with twine, and carved symbols etched into the bark of trees. This isn't normal," Elena muttered, staring at one of the symbols. It looked like a crude eye, its gaze following them no matter where they stood. Marcus tried to laugh it off. "Ha! Local weirdos. Every forest has them." But no one laughed. The shadows. By dusk, they found another clearing and set up camp. They ate in silence, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves setting them on edge. It was Dan who noticed it first. "What's that?" he whispered, pointing toward the tree line. Something was moving in the shadows. Not animals, something bigger, shapes that flickered and wavered, as if made of smoke. They circled the clearing, just out of reach of the firelight. "Is it people?" Jess whispered, clutching Marcus's arm. "Stay calm," Tom said. though his knuckles whitened as he gripped a stick. The shapes didn't come closer, but they didn't leave either. They just watched, their forms shifting like black water. That night, no one slept. The vanishing. By morning, Marcus was gone. His tent was empty, his pack still inside. There was no sign of struggle, no trail to follow. Just the same clawed footprints leading away from the camp. "We need to get out of here," Elena said, her voice shaking. "We don't even know where here is," Ava snapped. They argued, panic seeping into every word. Eventually, they decided to keep moving. The shadows followed them. Sometimes they were far away, barely visible between the trees. Other times they were closer, just at the edge of sight. By noon, Jess began mumbling under her breath. "What's she saying?" Elena whispered to Tom. He leaned closer, but her words didn't make sense. A string of guttural sounds, like a language that didn't belong in any human mouth. "Jess," he said softly. She turned to him, her eyes wide and unfocused. "They're hungry," she whispered. By evening, Jess had disappeared too. The revelation. Now it was just Tom, Elena, Ava, and Dan. Exhausted and terrified, they stumbled into another clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Symbols covered its bark, and at its base lay piles of bones. Human bones. "This isn't real," Ava whispered, backing away. But Tom knelt down, picking up a skull. It was real. "They brought us here," he said, his voice hollow. "Who?" Elena asked. "The shadows," Tom replied. "They've been herding us, watching us, waiting." As if in response, the shadows emerged from the trees surrounding the clearing. This time, they didn't linger at the edges. They stepped forward, their forms solidifying into grotesque figures, tall, gaunt, with featureless faces and clawed hands. The final moments. Panic erupted. Ava screamed and ran, but one of the figures moved impossibly fast, cutting her off. She fell to her knees, sobbing as the shadow loomed over her. Tom grabbed a branch and swung it wildly, but the shadow passed through it as though it was smoke. "Run!" he shouted at Elena and Dan. But there was nowhere to go. The shadows closed in, their forms blotting out the sky. The last thing Tom saw was a gaping void where the creature's face should have been, pulling him into endless darkness. By dawn, the forest was silent again. The campsite was gone, and the clearing lay empty, save for the massive tree and the bones beneath it. Black Hollow kept its secrets, as it always had.